There is something remarkable about the way life unfolds when we take a step back and realize we are not the ones in control. We like to think we have it all figured out. We make plans, set goals, build expectations, and yet time and time again, life reminds us that we are not the authors of our own story. We are not the architects of destiny. There is a far greater hand at work, one that we cannot always see, but one that is always moving, always orchestrating, always planning. You see, God's wisdom in planning far exceeds our understanding. His ways are higher than our ways, and His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. When we look around, we see only a fraction of the picture. We see the immediate, the temporary, the moment right in front of us. But God sees everything, the past, the present, and the future, all woven together into a masterpiece that we can barely comprehend. Think about a moment in your life when something didn't go the way you wanted it to. Maybe you prayed for an opportunity and the door never opened. Maybe you worked tirelessly toward a dream, only to see it crumble before your eyes. In those moments, it's easy to wonder, God, where are you? Why didn't this happen? Why didn't you make a way? But what if I told you that the very thing you were asking for might have led you away from the best that God had in store? What if the closed doors, the delays, the disappointments, what if they weren't signs of God's absence, but rather evidence of His presence? Sometimes we mistake God's rejections for neglect, when in reality they are redirections. We think that just because something didn't happen the way we envisioned, it means that God isn't working in our favor. But He is. He always is. The problem is we often judge God's plan based on our own limited perspective. We see the struggle, but God sees the growth. We see the loss, but God sees the gain. We see the pain, but God sees the purpose. It reminds me of a story about a young boy who wanted nothing more than to fly a kite. He ran outside on a day when the wind was particularly strong, holding tightly to the string as his kite soared higher and higher. But the wind was so fierce that it eventually snapped the string and the kite drifted out of sight. Heartbroken, the boy ran to his father, tears in his eyes, asking why it had to happen. The father smiled gently and said, "Son, you only saw the string holding your kite down. But what you didn't see was that the wind was leading it to an even greater height, beyond what you could have reached on your own." That's what God does with our lives. We cling to the strings of our own understanding, believing that we know best, but sometimes God lets go of what we're holding on to, not to leave us a labor, but to take us higher to places we never imagined. We may not see it in the moment, but later when we look back, we realize that God was guiding us all along. You might be going through a season right now where nothing makes sense. Maybe you're questioning why things have happened the way they have. Maybe you've been praying for clarity, for direction, for a sign that God is still working in your life. Let me tell you this, God is not absent. He has not forgotten you. He is still writing your story, in every detail, every chapter, every unexpected turn is part of a divine plan that is greater than anything you could have written for yourself. Have you ever watched an artist paint? At first, all you see are random strokes of color, shapes that don't seem to fit together. But as time passes, those brushstrokes start forming something beautiful, something intentional. That's how God works in our lives. The moments that seem confusing, the seasons that feel uncertain, those are the brushstrokes of a masterpiece in progress. And when we trust the artist, when we surrender our need to understand every detail, we begin to see the beauty in the process. The Bible tells us in Proverbs, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your path straight." Notice what it says, lean not on your own understanding. That's because our understanding is limited. But when we trust in Him, when we let go of our need to control, God leads us in ways we never could have imagined. I've seen this in my own life. There have been moments when I thought I knew what was best, only to later realize that God had something far greater in store. And if I had gotten what I wanted in that moment, I would have settled for something less than what God had planned. So today, I want to encourage you, if you're in a place where you don't understand why things are happening the way they are, don't lose faith. Don't let discouragement take hold. Instead, choose to trust. Choose to believe that God sees the bigger picture, that He is working even when you can't see it, that He is making a way where there seems to be no way. One day you'll look back and everything that seemed uncertain will make sense. Every delay, every disappointment, every closed door was all leading you to something greater. Because God is not just a planner. He is the best planner. And when you trust in him, you will never be led astray. This conclusion leaves an impact, reinforcing the trust in God's plan while setting up the next key points smoothly. Let me know if you'd like any refinements. Of all the lessons life teaches us, perhaps one of the hardest is learning to wait on God. We live in a world that celebrates speed, fast results, instant success, quick answers. We don't like waiting. We don't like uncertainty. We want things to happen now. And when they don't, it's easy to feel like something's wrong. We begin to wonder if God has forgotten us or if maybe he isn't listening. But you see, God's timing is not our timing. His process often takes longer than we expect, but it is never without purpose. There's a reason why the Bible so often tells us to wait on the Lord. Waiting is not a punishment, it's preparation. When God asks us to wait, he is not delaying to frustrate us. He is working behind the scenes, arranging things in ways we can't see. Sometimes God's no is really just a not yet. What we see as a delay is often divine protection, or it's God getting things ready both around us and within us. Think about it. If God gave you everything you asked for the moment you asked for it, would you really be ready to handle it? Sometimes the greatest blessing God can give us is to withhold something until the right time. We may think we're ready, but God in his perfect wisdom knows when the time is right. I remember hearing about a young woman who prayed fervently for a certain job. She believed it was her dream opportunity. She did everything right. She prepared, she interviewed, she prayed, but the answer came back as a no. She was devastated. She couldn't understand why God would allow her to get so close only to shut the door in her face. She wrestled with it for months. But just a year later, the company she had wanted so badly to work for went bankrupt. What she thought was a rejection was actually God's protection. And not long after that, a far better opportunity came her way, one she never could have imagined. How often do we experience that? We pray for something, and when it doesn't happen, we assume God isn't working. But sometimes the blessing is in the waiting. Sometimes God is saving us from something we don't even know about. Sometimes he's preparing something better than we asked for, and sometimes he's preparing us. Because the truth is, waiting changes us, it stretches our faith, it deepens our trust. It teaches us to rely on God instead of our own understanding. When we are forced to wait, we come face to face with our own limitations. We realize that we can't make everything happen on our own. And it's in that place of surrender that God begins to work the most powerfully. There's a story in the Bible about Abraham and Sarah. God promised them a son, but years went by and nothing happened. They grew older. The promise seemed impossible, so they took matters into their own hands. They tried to force the plan instead of trusting God's timing. And the result brought pain and confusion into their family for generations. But when God finally fulfilled his promise in his time, not theirs, Isaac was born, and through him a great nation was established. That's what happens when we rush ahead of God. We create problems. We settle for less than what he intended. But when we wait, when we trust God's plans unfold perfectly. Maybe you're in a season right now where it feels like nothing is moving. You've prayed. You've done your part. But the breakthrough hasn't come. The relationship hasn't been restored. The door hasn't opened. You look around and it seems like everyone else is moving forward, but you're stuck. Let me tell you this, you are not stuck. You are being prepared. God's silence is not his absence. He is working even when you can't see it. The farmer plants the seed, but he doesn't see the harvest overnight. There's a season of waiting, a season where nothing seems to be happening. But underground roots are growing. Strength is being built. And when the time is right, the harvest comes. God is not in a hurry. We may feel pressed by the clock, but he is eternal. He sees what we cannot see. He knows what we do not know. And when we trust him, when we truly trust him, we find rest even in the waiting. So don't give up. Don't let impatience steal your faith. Don't let the enemy whisper that God has forgotten you. He hasn't, he never will. The one who began a good work in you will carry it to completion. You may not see it yet, but your breakthrough is on the way. Your answer is coming. And when it does, it will be right on time because God is never late. He is the best planner, and his timing is always perfect. Life has a way of bringing us to our knees. There are moments when the weight of the world presses down so hard that we wonder how we'll ever stand again. We pray for answers, we plead for relief, and sometimes all we get in return is silence. We ask God to remove the struggle, but the struggle stays. We ask Him to change our circumstances, but instead He begins to change us. It's in those moments when we're walking through the fire that we start to see God is not only working around us, He is working within us. We don't like pain, we avoid it, we try to pray it away, run from it, escape it. But pain has a purpose. God never wastes a trial. He never allows a difficulty in your life without using it to shape you into something stronger, something better, something more like Him. It's in the valley that our faith is tested. It's in the storm that our trust is stretched. And it's in the struggle that we find out who we really are, and more importantly, who God really is. I've met people who thought their lives were over because of what they went through: loss, betrayal, sickness, failure. But when you talk to them now, they'll tell you it was in those dark moments that they found God in a way they never had before. It was in their weakness that they discovered His strength. It was in their heartbreak that they felt His love wrap around them. The very thing they thought would destroy them became the thing that saved them. Because God doesn't just pull us out of the fire, sometimes He walks with us through it. There's a man I met once years ago who told me his story. He had lost his job, his home, and his family all within the span of a few months. He was angry at God. He felt abandoned, forgotten. He told me that one night he sat alone in his car weeping, and he cried out, "God, where are you? Why did you let this happen?" And he said in that quiet darkness he didn't hear an audible voice, but he felt something, peace. A peace that didn't make sense. He realized that God was there all along. And as he began to rebuild his life, he looked back on that season and said, "It was the hardest thing I ever faced, but it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because I found God in a way I never knew Him before." You see, we want God to change our situation, but often He's more interested in changing us. He's shaping our character. He's building endurance in us. He's teaching us to depend on Him, not on our own strength. Because when everything is going well, it's easy to trust God. It's easy to say God is good. But real faith is born in the struggle. Real trust is forged in the trial. Think about Joseph in the Bible. God gave him a dream of greatness, but before that dream was fulfilled, Joseph was betrayed by his brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and unjustly imprisoned. For years, it must have seemed like everything was going wrong. But God was working. Every trial Joseph faced was preparing him for the position God had promised. When Joseph finally stood in that place of power, he was able to look back and say to his brothers, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." That's what God does. He takes what was meant to break you, and He uses it to build you. He takes what the enemy meant for harm, and He turns it for good. Your pain has a purpose. Your struggle is not wasted. God is using it to strengthen you, to refine you, to prepare you for the blessing that is ahead. But in the middle of it, it's hard to see that. When you're in the fire, it just feels like you're being burned. It feels like you're being broken, but you're not. You're being purified. You're being molded. And when you come out on the other side, you'll be stronger, you'll be wiser, you'll be closer to God than you ever thought possible. Maybe you're in that place right now. Maybe life has knocked you down and you don't know if you'll ever get back up. You're asking God, why? Why this pain? Why this loss? Why this heartache? I can't tell you all the answers, but I can tell you this: God is with you. He sees you. He hasn't abandoned you. He's using this season to shape you into the person He created you to be. Don't give up. Don't lose heart. The struggle is not the end of your story. It's part of your testimony. And one day you'll look back and see that God was there all along, working, planning, turning what was meant for harm into something beautiful. Because He is the best planner. And He never makes mistakes. We like to believe we know what's best for our lives. We map out our future, set our goals, and tell ourselves that if we work hard enough, if we plan well enough, everything will fall into place just as we imagine. We think we've got it figured out, but then life happens. The doors we thought would open stay closed. The opportunities we were sure would be ours slip away. What seemed certain suddenly becomes uncertain. And in those moments, we are faced with a choice: will we trust our plans or will we trust God's? It's not easy to let go. It's not easy to surrender the dreams we've held onto so tightly. We cling to them because they feel safe, they feel familiar, they feel right. But what we often fail to see is that our plans are built on limited knowledge. We see only a tiny piece of the puzzle, but God sees the entire picture. He knows the end from the beginning. He sees the dangers we cannot see. He knows the paths that lead to blessing and the roads that lead to heartache. And because He loves us, He sometimes redirects us even when we don't understand it. There was a man I spoke with once who built his life around a business he started from the ground up. He poured everything into it, his time, his money, his heart. It was his dream. But after years of success, things started to fall apart. Contracts fell through, debts piled up, and he lost it all. He told me that he felt like God had let him down. He had prayed for success, he had asked for help, and yet everything crumbled. But as the months went by, something began to happen. He started spending more time with his family, something he had neglected during those busy years. He began volunteering at his church, using his leadership skills to serve others, and he found a new purpose, one that he said brought him more joy than he had ever known in his business days. He told me, I thought losing my business was the end, but God was just shifting my path. He was leading me to something better. That's how God works. We may think we're losing, but in reality, we're being led. We may see failure, but God sees redirection. When our plans fall apart, it's not because God has abandoned us, it's because He is guiding us towards something we cannot yet see. Think about Jonah. God told him to go to Nineveh, but Jonah had his own plan. He ran in the opposite direction. He thought he knew better. But God had a plan not just for Jonah, but for an entire city that needed to hear the message of salvation. When Jonah resisted, God didn't give up on him. He sent a storm, and then He sent a fish not to punish Jonah, but to bring him back to the right path. Jonah thought the storm was the end. He thought the fish was his downfall. But both were part of God's rescue plan. What looked like trouble was actually grace. That's what we often miss. When God interrupts our plans, it's not because He's against us. It's because He's for us. He loves us too much to let us settle for less than what He has prepared. But surrendering to His plan requires faith. It requires us to let go of our need for control. It requires us to trust that God knows what He's doing even when we don't. It's hard. We live in a world that tells us we should be the masters of our own fate. We are taught to chart our own course, to make things happen, to take control. But real peace comes when we realize that we were never meant to carry that burden. We are not the authors of our story. God is, and He is the best planner. I've seen it in my own life. There were times I was so sure I knew what I needed. I prayed for certain things. I chased certain dreams, and when they didn't work out, I felt disappointed. But looking back, I can see that every closed door was a blessing. Every delay was protection. Every redirection was God's hand guiding me to something greater. And I thank Him for not giving me what I thought I wanted, because what He gave me instead was far better. Maybe you're in that place right now. Maybe your plans have fallen apart. Maybe you're standing in front of a door that won't open and you're asking God, why? I want you to know this: God sees what you cannot see. He is not trying to harm you. He is leading you. Trust Him. Surrender your plans, lay them at His feet, and say, God, not my will, but yours be done. It's not easy, but it's where freedom is found. It's where peace is found. It's where the best blessings are found. Because God's plan is always better. He is the best planner, and He never makes a mistake. There are times in life when we reach the end of ourselves. We've done all we can do. We've tried every solution. We've exhausted every resource, and still nothing seems to change. We get to that place where we feel powerless, where we realize that our strength is not enough, our wisdom is not enough, and our plans are not enough. It's in those moments that we are reminded of a truth that is easy to forget when life is going well. God is our only source of true strength and help. We can build our lives on our talents, our hard work, our relationships, or our bank accounts, but when the storm comes, and it always does, things are not enough to hold us up. They may sustain us for a while, but eventually we all face something that money can't fix, that hard work can't solve, that human wisdom can't figure out. That's when we realize how much we need God. Not just as a distant figure we pray to when things get tough, but as our daily source of strength, our constant guide, the one who holds us together when everything else falls apart. I remember a man who shared his story with me after his wife was diagnosed with a terminal illness. He was a strong man, successful in business, respected by his peers. He was used to solving problems, used to being in control. But when he heard the doctor's words, he felt helpless for the first time in his life. He told me that at first he fought against it. He tried everything, every treatment, every specialist, every option, but nothing changed. And it was there in that place of desperation that he turned to God like he never had before. He said, I had always believed in God, but I had never leaned on him. I had never needed him like that. Through tears, he told me how in those long nights by his wife's bedside, he found a peace he couldn't explain. He found a strength he knew wasn't his own. And even though the outcome wasn't what he had prayed for, he told me that God carried him through it. He said, I thought I needed answers, but what I really needed was God. That's what so many of us discover when we walk through the valleys of life. We learn that God is not just someone we call on in emergencies. He is our daily bread. He is the one who sustains us when we can't take another step. He is the one who gives us the strength to keep going when everything in us wants to give up. The psalmist said it best, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. He's not a distant help. He's not an occasional help. He is a present help, right here, right now in the middle of your storm. But we have to let him be our strength. We have to stop trying to carry it all on our own. That's the hardest part for so many of us. We want to be strong. We want to fix it ourselves. We think relying on God means we're weak. But the truth is, we are weak, all of us. We just spend most of our lives trying to pretend we're not. Real strength is found in surrender. Real strength is found when we say, God, I can't do this, but I know you can. That's why Paul said, when I am weak, then I am strong. Because when we come to the end of ourselves, that's when we begin to experience the power of God. That's when we discover that his grace is sufficient. His strength is made perfect in our weakness. And when we lean on him, we find that he carries us farther than we ever could have gone on our own. Maybe you're in that place today. Maybe you've been trying to hold everything together, trying to be strong for your family, trying to fix a situation that seems beyond fixing, and you're exhausted. You're running on empty. You're wondering how much longer you can keep this up. I want you to know you don't have to do it on your own. You were never meant to carry it all. God is here and he is ready to be your strength. He is ready to hold you up when you can't stand. He is ready to give you peace that passes understanding, joy that doesn't make sense, and hope when everything around you looks hopeless. But you have to let go. You have to place it in his hands. Whatever it is, your health, your marriage, your children, your future, give it to him. Trust him with it. Let him be your source of strength. Because when you lean on God, you will find that he is faithful. You will find that his strength never runs out. You will find that he is the best planner, and he will carry you through every storm. And when you come through it, and you'll look back and realize that it wasn't your strength that brought you through. It was his. Because he is the best planner, and he is always enough. There's something we all long for deep within our hearts. It's a desire that stretches beyond any earthly success, beyond wealth, beyond recognition. It's the desire to know that our lives matter, that we are part of something greater than ourselves. We want to know that we're not just here by accident, that there is a purpose for our lives, a reason for our existence. And that purpose, that meaning, can only truly be found in God's plan. We try to find it in other places. We chase after careers, relationships, status, or security, hoping that somewhere along the way we'll stumble into the life we were meant to live. We fill our days with busyness, our calendars with appointments, and our minds with plans. But at the end of it all, there's still that ache or quiet question in our hearts asking, is this all there is? That question is not there by accident. It's God's whisper reminding us that we were made for more. He designed each of us with a purpose, a unique calling that fits perfectly into his greater plan. We are not random. We are not mistakes. We were created intentionally by the best planner, and he placed us here at this time in this place for a reason. I remember a man I met once who had spent his entire life climbing the corporate ladder. He had everything the world would call success, a beautiful home, a respected title, financial security. But he told me that when he reached the top, he felt more empty than ever before. He said, I thought getting here would finally make me feel like I had made it, but instead I feel lost. He shared that he had built his life around his own plans, his own ambitions, but he had never stopped to ask, God, what is your plan for me? That's a question so many of us forget to ask. We ask God to bless our plans, but we rarely stop to ask him what his plan is. We get so caught up in our dreams that we miss the fact that God's dream for our lives is far greater. His plan is not just about success, it's about significance. It's about living a life that leaves a lasting impact. It's about being part of something eternal. When we align our lives with God's purpose, everything changes. It doesn't mean life becomes easy. It doesn't mean we won't face trials or setbacks. But it means we walk with a sense of direction, a sense of meaning, knowing that every step we take is part of something bigger than we can see. It means that even when life doesn't make sense, we can trust that God is weaving together a story that is far greater than anything we could write on our own. I think about Moses, just an ordinary man who was tending sheep in the wilderness when God called him. Moses didn't see himself as a leader. He didn't feel qualified. He had his own plans, his own limitations. But God had a purpose for him that was greater than anything Moses could have imagined. God called him to lead an entire nation to freedom. And though Moses felt inadequate, or though he doubted himself, God's plan prevailed. Because it was never about Moses' ability, it was about God's power working through him. That's the beauty of God's plan for our lives. He doesn't choose us because we're the smartest, the strongest, or the most talented. He chooses us because he loves us. And he equips us for whatever he calls us to do. When we step into his plan, we don't walk in our own strength. We walk in his. We don't have to have all the answers. We simply have to say, here I am, Lord, use me. Maybe you've been searching for your purpose. Maybe you've been trying to figure out where you fit, what your life is supposed to look like. I want you to know you are not forgotten. God sees you. He knows you by name. And he has a plan for you. It may not look like what you expected. It may not follow the timeline you had in mind. But it is good. It is perfect. And it is filled with eternal significance. The greatest fulfillment in life comes when we surrender our plans and say, God, I want what you want. Lead me, use me for your glory. That's when we truly begin to live. That's when we discover the joy of being part of something far greater than ourselves. Because the best planner holds your future. And his plan is always good.